Hello everyone, and welcome back to Creepy Mr. Knight. I know many of you enjoy using these videos to help you sleep, so before you drift off, I thought it'd be fun for everyone to leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the content. Now, let's get comfy, relax, and begin. Story 1. The rain had been relentless for days, and tonight it pounded against the windows of Detective Thompson's office as if trying to force its way in. The muffled sounds of the city outside blended with the hum of fluorescent lights overhead, creating an atmosphere that was thick with the kind of tension only an unsolved case could breed. Thompson leaned back in his creaking chair, his fingers absent-mindedly tracing the edges of an old case file in front of him. The file had been sitting there for weeks, an old robbery case he had no intention of solving. His mind wasn't on it. The phone rang, sharp and abrupt, pulling Thompson out of his reverie. He snatched it up, his voice steady, despite the unease he felt building in his chest. "Detective Thompson," he answered. "Thompson, you need to get down here now," the voice on the other end said. It was Sergeant Daniels, his tone clipped and strained. "It's Kane." Thompson's heart skipped a beat at the mention of Officer Kane. The name struck a chord deep in his chest. Kane wasn't just any officer, he was one of the best, a man of unwavering morals, someone who had earned the respect of the entire department and the city he protected. Kane had been more than a colleague. He had been Thompson's friend, his partner in many of the department's toughest cases. The thought of him being in trouble, it didn't sit right. "What happened?" Thompson asked, his voice taut with concern. "I don't know yet, but you need to come to his house. It's bad. Real bad," Daniels said, his voice cracking. "I'll be there in 20. Thompson hung up the phone, his mind racing. What could possibly have happened to Kane? The image of Kane, so solid and reliable, didn't align with the image of someone in danger, let alone someone who was dead. The drive to Kane's home felt too long, each minute dragging more than the last. Thompson's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, the rain splattering against his windshield like an endless barrage. When he finally pulled up to the modest two-story house, he immediately noticed the scene outside. Yellow crime tape, uniformed officers standing guard, and a cluster of people whispering. His stomach turned as he parked the car, feeling the weight of something ominous in the air. Sergeant Daniels was waiting by the front door. His face was pale, eyes wide and tired. The officer didn't say anything as Thompson approached. There was no need. He could read it in the man's face. Something terrible had happened. "Inside," Daniels muttered, nodding toward the door. Thompson stepped into the house, his shoes heavy against the hardwood floors. The air inside was thick with tension, a quiet hum of fear and confusion hanging in the stillness. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Kane's house had always been warm, inviting, full of life, but now it felt empty, cold, and desolate. The living room was dim, with shadows stretching across the floor in odd angles. Then he saw it. Kane's body was lying on the floor, a lifeless, cold figure draped in his police uniform. His face was turned upward, eyes wide open, frozen in a state of shock. Thompson could hardly breathe for a moment, a knot tightening in his throat. This wasn't just a shooting, it was something far worse. What caught his eye wasn't just the blood that pooled beneath Kane's body, but the scrawled words on the wall behind him. "Tell them the truth." The words were written in blood, smeared across the wall in a jagged scrawl that sent chills up Thompson's spine. A message, a demand. Who found him? Thompson's voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper, as he tore his gaze away from the blood-stained words and looked to Daniels. "His wife," Daniels replied. His voice cracked with the weight of the moment. "She came home this morning, found him like this. She's in the other room." Thompson took a long breath, steeling himself. "We'll get to that. I need to know everything about the scene first." "Of course." Daniels motioned for him to follow, guiding him to where Kane's body lay. We've secured the area. We're still waiting on the forensics team, but it's clear this wasn't a robbery gone wrong. There's no sign of forced entry, no valuables missing. This was personal. Thompson's eyes scanned the room, noting the unsettling stillness. There was nothing out of place, nothing that stood out except for Kane's body and the message scrawled on the wall. He bent over Kane's body, careful not to disturb anything. There was no sign of struggle, no defensive wounds. Kane had been caught by surprise. The shot had been clean, executed with chilling precision. Thompson could hardly believe it. He stood and faced Daniels. Who could have done this, he asked, his mind already starting to piece things together. Who would want to kill Kane? I wish I knew, Daniels replied, shaking his head. But there's no one who comes to mind right now. Kane didn't have any obvious enemies. Thompson stared at the blood on the wall again. Tell them the truth. But what truth? What was Kane trying to say? Was the message meant for him? For the police? For someone else entirely? Thompson's mind raced. He needed answers. As the days passed, the investigation into Kane's death deepened, but no answers came easily. Thompson's sense of unease grew with each new lead that went nowhere. He revisited Kane's life, combed through old case files, and interviewed his colleagues, hoping to find some clue as to what might have motivated such a brutal, targeted killing. There were no signs of a struggle at Kane's house, no forced entry, no valuables taken. It was clear that whoever killed him had a personal vendetta. The only clue, the cryptic message, was his only lead. Thompson's next move was to meet with Captain Garrett. Garrett had been a mentor to both him and Kane, and he knew Kane better than anyone. If anyone could provide insight, it would be Garrett. The captain's office was cluttered, the shelves lined with trophies, old case files, and faded photos from a time long past. The captain himself was seated behind his desk, wearing the wearied expression of a man who'd seen too much. "Thompson," Garrett greeted, his voice rough, "I've been hearing the same thing you have. Kane's death. It doesn't make sense." "I came to you because I need to know everything about Kane," Thompson said, his tone urgent. "He didn't just make enemies on the job. There's something here we're missing." Garrett leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping the desk. "I've worked with Kane for years. He wasn't a man to make enemies unnecessarily. Sure, he pissed some people off over the years. He could be stubborn, a little too righteous for some, but he didn't deserve to go out like this." Thompson nodded. "I need to know about his last few cases. What was he involved in recently? Anything unusual?" Garrett hesitated, his eyes clouded. "There was one thing. A few months ago, Kane started digging into something. Internal corruption involving officers and organized crime. He didn't tell anyone, not even me, but I've heard whispers." Thompson felt the familiar chill creep up his spine. Kane had always been the kind of cop to follow the rules, even when it was hard. He'd never been one to rock the boat, but if Kane had been investigating corruption, especially inside the department, he had likely made powerful enemies. "Do you have any names?" Thompson asked. Garrett shook his head. "I wish I could help, Thompson, but I don't know." Kane kept his cards close to his chest. He wouldn't talk about it. Thompson's stomach twisted. If Kane had been investigating something this dangerous, it was no wonder someone wanted him silenced. The question was, who? And why now? Was it just to stop Kane from uncovering something? Or was there something more to the murder than revenge? Over the next few days, Thompson met with more of Kane's colleagues, trying to uncover any clues that might shed light on the mystery. One name kept coming up: Detective Mark Calloway. Calloway was known for his hard-nosed approach, often playing in the gray areas of the law. He had a reputation for bending the rules when it suited him, something that had caused friction with Kane over the years. Thompson knew Calloway well. The two had tangled over cases in the past, but he never suspected Calloway to be involved in something like this. When Thompson found him, Calloway was sitting in a darkened corner booth of a local bar, nursing a drink that looked like it had been untouched for too long. His unshaven face and bloodshot eyes suggested he'd been drinking away the tension from a long week. "Thompson," Calloway said as the detective slid into the seat across from him. "Heard about Kane. Shocking, right? You think it's related to all that corruption talk?" Thompson narrowed his eyes. "You know something about that?" Calloway looked away. "Kane was digging into something big. We all knew it, but he wouldn't let on what it was. I don't know why he kept it a secret, but he was pulling away from everyone." Thompson leaned forward, his voice low. "And you didn't think it was worth mentioning? You didn't think it could be important?" Calloway finally looked him in the eye. "I didn't think it would come to this, Thompson, but Kane made a lot of enemies. You didn't know him like I did." Thompson's stomach twisted as he looked at Calloway, sensing the gravity of what he was about to hear. "Who do you think did this?" Calloway didn't answer right away. Instead, he finished his drink and pushed the glass aside. "I think Kane was onto something bigger than we realize, and whoever did this is trying to bury it before it gets out." Thompson sat back, staring at Calloway, trying to read between the lines of what was unsaid. "I think we're dealing with something darker than we thought," Calloway added softly. The days blurred into each other as Thompson plunged deeper into the investigation. Each step forward seemed to reveal only more questions, more confusion. Kane's death was beginning to take on a shape he didn't want to understand. He'd known the officer his whole career, his colleague, his friend, and yet, with every new piece of the puzzle, he realized he had never really known him at all. The more Thompson investigated, the more it became clear that Kane had not just been a victim of some random act of violence. No, this had been a carefully calculated strike, aimed at silencing someone who had gotten too close to the truth. The anonymous letter Emily Kane had mentioned was a potential lead. Emily had reluctantly handed it over to Thompson, a small, yellowed envelope that had the faintest hint of mildew. He stared at it in his hands for a long moment before carefully opening it. Inside was a single page of paper, a letter written in careful, precise handwriting. It was brief but chilling. "You're asking too many questions, Kane. You won't like the answers. No signature, no return address, just a threat." Thompson felt a cold chill grip him. Someone was watching. Someone knew Kane had been digging, and they were sending a message. This wasn't just a random criminal act. This was personal. The question was, who had enough power to send such a message, and what was it that Kane had been uncovering? Thompson's mind returned to Captain Garrett's words. Kane had been investigating corruption within the department, particularly concerning officers tied to organized crime. This was the piece of the puzzle Thompson had been missing. If Kane had been investigating fellow officers, it was no wonder he'd been killed. But who exactly was involved? Was it possible that a high-ranking officer was behind it? Was Garrett's hesitation a sign he knew more than he was letting on? Thompson felt a creeping unease. If he was to get to the bottom of this, he would need to go deeper than he ever had before, into the heart of the police force, into the darkness where corruption festered. Days passed, and the investigation led Thompson into the underbelly of the city's police force. There were whispers, but no concrete answers. It was as if the entire department had circled the wagons, refusing to let anything slip through. Thompson knew that Kane had made enemies, but how deep did it go? Who in the department had the most to lose from Kane's investigation? Kane had been a straight shooter, always operating on the belief that justice and the law were above personal gain. But the closer Thompson got to the truth, the more it seemed that there were those in the department who thought differently. The more he pressed, the more doors closed. Calls were unreturned. Colleagues clammed up. But there was one place where the truth might lie, in the evidence vault. He'd always known about the corruption rumors that swirled around certain officers, but it wasn't until he spoke with retired Detective Lewis Marsh that the floodgates started to open. Marsh had been around when the rumors had first begun circulating, back when Kane had started to push back against the corrupt practices taking root within the department. Kane had made it clear to Marsh that there was something he had discovered, something that needed to be revealed, but he couldn't risk going public yet. But now, Thompson began to believe that perhaps Kane had been on the verge of uncovering something much larger than anyone had imagined. "I heard about the investigations," Marsh said quietly, glancing around as though the walls themselves were listening. Kane was digging into more than just petty corruption. You see, there were officers working with a local crime syndicate, drug dealers, money launderers, the whole shebang. Some of them were pulling strings from inside the force, using their badges to shield criminals. Kane had his eyes on them for a long time, but he was careful about how much he exposed. He knew the risks, but I guess someone else got to him first. Thompson's mind raced. There it was, the answer to the question he'd been asking. Kane had been onto something that reached deep within the heart of the department. The possibility that corrupt officers were working alongside criminals had been something Thompson had heard rumors about for years, but it was never confirmed. Now, it was becoming clear that Kane had been on the verge of exposing this. "I need to know more," Thompson said, his voice urgent. "Do you have names? Any leads?" Marsh shook his head slowly. "I can't give you names, Thompson. They're too well connected. They know who's digging around. They'll do anything to cover it up. But I'll tell you this, if you're going to find the truth, you have to go beyond the department. Don't trust anyone in uniform, not now." Thompson took the information in, his mind turning over the possibilities. If Marsh was right, then Kane's death wasn't just the work of a rogue criminal. It was a coordinated hit designed to shut him up before he could expose the entire operation. Thompson's next step was to follow the trail of the money. Kane had been investigating officers who had ties to organized crime. But how far did it go? If officers were in bed with criminals, there had to be financial records, payments, bribes, something. He requested access to Kane's files, combing through old case files and reports in the hopes of finding something, anything that would lead him closer to the truth. And then, after hours of searching, he found it. A series of financial transactions had been flagged in a case file from Kane's investigation. They were subtle at first, small payments from local businesses to officers. But as Thompson dug deeper, the payments became larger, more frequent. Kane had followed the money to a few specific officers, all of whom had been involved in covering up major drug trafficking operations. The deeper Thompson dug, the clearer it became. There was a network of officers working directly with the crime syndicate. But just as he was beginning to piece it all together, something unexpected happened. Thompson's office phone rang again. "Detective Thompson?" the voice on the other end asked. It was a voice he didn't recognize, but it was familiar in its tone. Smooth, calm, dangerous. "You don't know me, but I know you. I know you're getting close. If you keep digging, you'll be next." Thompson's blood ran cold. "Who is this?" The voice on the other end chuckled softly. "Just a friend. A word of advice, stop before it's too late." The line went dead. Thompson sat there for a moment, his mind racing. He was getting too close. Whoever had killed Kane knew he was on the trail. They were watching him now. As Thompson continued to push forward, the walls around him began to close in. Every move he made seemed to draw unwanted attention, and the pressure began to mount. The higher he climbed in his investigation, the more danger he found himself in. The thin thread of truth was now tangled in a dangerous web, and if he wasn't careful, he could end up just like Kane. He found the answers he was looking for in a private meeting with a former criminal informant named Rafael "Raf" Sanchez. Sanchez had once been a low-level player in the city's criminal world, but he had turned on his former associates when he realized the danger of their lifestyle. Now, he lived under heavy protection, keeping a low profile in exchange for information. "Thompson, I heard you've been sniffing around the department," Sanchez said, looking over his shoulder as if someone might be watching. "Let me give you one piece of advice. You don't want to go down this road. Trust me, the guys behind Kane's death, they own this town." Thompson leaned in. "I know, I'm close. I just need to know who's at the top, who's behind it all." Sanchez hesitated, then sighed. "All right, but you didn't hear this from me. The person pulling the strings. It's not just a cop. It's someone higher up. Someone who has everything to lose if this operation goes public." Thompson's heart raced. "Who?" Sanchez looked around once more, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The mayor's office. The mayor's connected to the syndicate. I'm telling you, Thompson, this thing goes all the way to the top." Thompson's hands shook as he processed the information. The mayor? This was bigger than he had ever imagined. Kane's death had been a calculated move by those who had the most to lose. The mayor was involved in this? It was too much to process, but there was no turning back now. The final confrontation was inevitable. Thompson had no choice but to confront the truth, no matter the cost. He called for backup, but deep down, he knew this was something he would have to face on his own. As he prepared for the inevitable showdown, he realized that Kane had been right all along. Justice came at a price. In the end, Thompson didn't just uncover the truth. He became part of it. The weight of the discovery about the mayor's involvement hit Thompson like a freight train. The realization that a public official, someone sworn to uphold the law, was pulling the strings behind the scenes made the entire case feel like a dark conspiracy. Kane had been right all along, but the cost of revealing the truth had been his life. Thompson spent a sleepless night going over the evidence, looking for anything that could confirm what Sanchez had said. The mayor's office had long been suspected of shady dealings, but this was a whole new level of corruption. It wasn't just about money laundering or drug trafficking. It was about power, the kind of power that extended to the very core of the police department, and possibly even beyond. Thompson knew he had to act quickly. The longer he waited, the more danger he would be in. The mayor wasn't just a man of influence. He had connections, and those connections had already demonstrated their willingness to eliminate anyone who posed a threat. And now, Thompson was a target. He spent the next few days working tirelessly, cross-referencing old police reports, making discreet calls, and following every lead, hoping to find something that would give him enough to confront the mayor. The deeper he dug, the darker the web became. Officers he'd trusted, officers he'd worked with for years, were implicated in this vast criminal operation. But every time he thought he had a solid lead, it slipped away, like sand through his fingers. The police force was fractured now. Those who were involved in the mayor's corruption turned a blind eye to the investigation, while others, like Sergeant Daniels, were trying to help Thompson as best as they could without putting themselves in danger. But even Daniels had limits. There was only so much he could do without being targeted. Thompson had to make a decision. He couldn't wait any longer. He had to go to the one place that could bring it all to a head, the mayor's office. The final confrontation was upon him. The evening of the showdown, Thompson drove to City Hall, his heart pounding in his chest. He'd made a calculated decision. He wasn't going to tiptoe around the edges of this investigation anymore. He would confront the mayor directly, armed with the evidence he had gathered. It was a dangerous game, but it was the only option left. When Thompson arrived, the massive granite building loomed before him, illuminated in the pale light of the street lamps. It looked almost imposing, like a fortress that protected its secrets. Thompson parked his car in a nearby alley, the rain still falling heavily, adding to the atmosphere of dread that had settled over him. He knew the risks. The mayor was a well-protected man. There would be armed security, hidden cameras, and no telling what other resources he could use to eliminate anyone who threatened his power. But Thompson wasn't afraid anymore. He wasn't going to be intimidated. Inside City Hall, the halls were eerily quiet, with only a few scattered employees lingering, finishing up their work for the day. Thompson made his way toward the mayor's office, avoiding the few guards who walked past, their attention elsewhere. His mind raced with what he would say when he finally came face to face with the man who had orchestrated Kane's death. Thompson found the mayor's office at the end of a long, quiet corridor. The door was slightly ajar, and Thompson could see the silhouette of the mayor through the frosted glass. He took a deep breath, adjusting the grip on his gun, and pushed the door open. Inside, Mayor Jonathan Westbrook was sitting behind his desk, reading through papers. He didn't look up when Thompson entered. "Detective Thompson," the mayor said smoothly, his voice as calm as ever. "I wasn't expecting you. What brings you here at this hour?" Thompson stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. His heart was racing, but his voice remained steady. "I know what you did, Westbrook. I know about the syndicate. And I know that you had Kane killed." The mayor's eyes flickered up from the papers he was reading. There was no shock, no panic, just a cold, calculating gaze. For a moment, there was a long silence as Westbrook regarded him, weighing his options. "You've been digging, haven't you?" Westbrook said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You're a tenacious one, Thompson. I respect that. But you're playing with fire, my friend. You should have walked away when you had the chance." "I'm not walking away," Thompson replied, his voice firm. "Kane didn't walk away. He paid the price for doing the right thing, and now I'm going to make sure you pay for what you've done." Westbrook leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "You really think you can stop me? You're just one man, and look at what you're up against. You've already lost your best friend. What makes you think you're going to win this fight?" Thompson's grip tightened on the gun, but he didn't raise it. He wasn't there to shoot, at least not yet. "I'm not here to win a fight. I'm here to make sure the truth gets out. People deserve to know who you really are." Westbrook chuckled darkly. "The truth? You think anyone will believe you? Do you really think the people will rise up against me? I'm untouchable. You're nothing more than a loose end. You should have stayed in your lane, Thompson." Before Thompson could respond, Westbrook pressed a button on his desk, and within moments, 2 armed guards entered the room, their guns drawn. Thompson was outnumbered, but he didn't flinch. He knew he was running out of time. "This is your last warning, Thompson," Westbrook said, standing slowly. "Walk out of here now, and maybe I'll forget about you. Otherwise, I'm afraid I'll have to deal with you the same way I dealt with Kane." Thompson's heart was pounding. He had no backup, no way out, but he couldn't back down. Kane wouldn't have backed down. Suddenly, there was a sharp bang, a sound that wasn't Thompson's gun, but something much louder. The guards turned around, startled, and Thompson seized the opportunity, grabbing the nearest guard's gun and knocking him out with a swift blow. The second guard fired, but Thompson ducked, and the bullet struck the wall instead. He dove behind a large filing cabinet, heart racing, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He needed to end this now. The truth had to come out. He couldn't let Westbrook get away with it. As the guards continued to search for him, Thompson took a deep breath and stood up, aiming his gun at Westbrook. The mayor's eyes widened for the briefest of moments. "Get on the floor," Thompson demanded, his voice cold and commanding. Westbrook, for the first time, looked genuinely concerned, but he didn't move. "You think this will end with you? The whole system's against you, Thompson. You're going to fall, and you're going to do it alone." But Thompson didn't back down. Not today. He handcuffed Westbrook, ensuring that the mayor had no chance of escape. The guards, now disarmed and subdued, watched helplessly as Thompson dragged the corrupt mayor out of the office. With the mayor now in custody, Thompson worked quickly to expose everything, every connection, every officer involved, and every crime that had been covered up. He sent copies of the evidence to the press, ensuring that no one could hide from the truth any longer. It wasn't easy. The fallout was massive. There were arrests, investigations, and public outcry. But through it all, Thompson stood firm. He knew the battle wasn't over, but for the first time since Kane's death, he felt like he was finally making progress. The truth had come to light, but at what cost? Thompson looked at the badge in his hand, the one he had earned alongside Kane so many years ago. It felt heavier now than it ever had before. Kane had been right. Justice wasn't easy, but in the end, it was worth it. Story 2. The early morning fog still clung to the streets as Detective Noah Lawson stepped into the quiet apartment complex. A murmur of activity from nearby workers and janitors filled the otherwise silent building, where the smell of stale coffee and cleaners lingered in the air. It was a grim place for a grim task. Marie Larkin's apartment was on the 4th floor, a nondescript unit at the end of the hall. The only thing setting it apart was the caution tape stretched across her door, warning anyone to stay away. Lawson had seen death more times than he cared to count, but there was something different about this one. When he entered the apartment, he immediately noticed the stark contrast between the serene surroundings and the tragedy that had occurred. The apartment was immaculately kept, the light filtering in from the open blinds and casting shadows over the hardwood floors. There was an elegance to the place, a sense of calm, until his eyes landed on the table. A single glass of wine sat alone, the deep red liquid still swirling in its base as if Marie had only just set it down. But she was dead, her body sprawled out on the couch, in an unnatural position, her eyes wide open in a permanent state of shock. There were no obvious signs of struggle, no marks or bruises, no broken furniture, no broken windows. The apartment was locked from the inside, and security footage showed nothing out of the ordinary for days before her death. It was as though Marie Larkin had simply vanished from the world. And yet, the letter. Lawson opened the envelope carefully, pulling out a plain white sheet of paper with no return address. The writing was neat but unnerving, each letter formed with a precise hand, the kind that suggested purpose. She was murdered. Find out why. That was it. No explanation, no clue, just the word murdered. And it hit Lawson with the weight of something he couldn't yet explain. If it was murder, then how? Why? And who would send such a cryptic letter? A cold shiver ran down his spine. There was more to Marie's life than met the eye, and Lawson knew this case would be far from simple. Marie Larkin had been married once, a long time ago, to a man named James Larkin. Lawson's first call was to the records department to find out what he could about the man. The name was familiar. James Larkin had died under mysterious circumstances nearly 5 years ago, a car crash on a lonely stretch of highway. His death had been ruled an accident, but the circumstances surrounding it were unusual to say the least. Marie had been a widow for 5 years, and in that time, she'd moved into her apartment in the city, kept to herself, and worked as a freelance consultant. From what Lawson could tell, she had no immediate family, no close friends who could shed light on her life. It seemed like everyone in her circle had faded into the background, like ghosts from a forgotten past. The autopsy report had come through by the afternoon. The cause of death was still undetermined, though signs pointed to poisoning. The toxicology results were pending, but the initial analysis suggested that Marie had ingested something that caused her heart to stop. No pills, no obvious chemical traces. Just an undetectable poison, perhaps something subtle enough to go unnoticed. It was clear to Lawson that someone wanted to make sure her death wouldn't be traced back to them. The method was careful, controlled. But why poison? And what did the letter mean by murdered? Was this more than just a simple act of killing? Was there a deeper reason behind her death? As Lawson sifted through the details, he began to dig into Marie's financial records, hoping to find a clue that might tie everything together. It wasn't long before he discovered a troubling pattern. Marie had been living beyond her means. Despite having a modest job, she had large debts, with recent payments to unknown individuals and companies that had no clear link to her work. And then, there it was. Marie had taken out a sizable life insurance policy just months before her death. It wasn't enormous, but the beneficiary list was what caught Lawson's attention. It had been changed recently, with an unfamiliar name listed, someone named Damon Kent. Damon Kent was the first real lead Lawson could follow. He wasn't a name that appeared in Marie's social circles or public records, and when Lawson first tried to track him down, he found little more than a dead end. There was no record of him living in the city, no trace of him in any financial database. It was as if he had never existed at all. But as Lawson pushed harder, he found something curious. Damon Kent had once been James Larkin's business partner. They had both been involved in a real estate venture just before James's death. But after the crash, the partnership had dissolved, and Kent seemed to vanish. Lawson had never heard of him before, but now Kent was tied to both Marie's past and her financial troubles. He needed to know more. Using his connections, Lawson managed to track down an old acquaintance who had worked with Kent in the past. The conversation was short, but illuminating. Kent had a reputation for being unpredictable. Charming one moment, aggressive the next. He had disappeared from the business world not long after James's death, and some whispered that Kent had been involved in less than legal activities. He's not the kind of guy who just fades away. He's trouble, the acquaintance had warned. Lawson now had a name, a possible link to James Larkin's death, and a man who had somehow disappeared just like Marie had. But was he really connected to her death? Or was he another piece of the puzzle designed to confuse the investigation? With only a name and a rough description, Lawson began his search for Damon Kent. He visited bars, real estate offices, and business contacts who might have known him in the past. But Kent was elusive. No one had seen him in years, and his last known address was a run-down apartment building on the outskirts of town. When Lawson finally made it to Kent's old apartment, the landlord was hesitant to help. "Don't think anyone's been in there for months," he muttered, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "I don't know where the guy went. Just up and left one day. No forwarding address, no nothing." After a little persuasion, the landlord handed over a key, and Lawson entered the apartment. It was eerily clean, almost as though Kent had prepared to leave in a hurry. But it was the notes and documents scattered across the floor that piqued Lawson's interest. Some appeared to be legal contracts, others handwritten notes detailing dates, names, and locations. And in the corner of the room was a dusty old safe, its lock now rusted and weak. With a bit of effort, Lawson cracked open the safe. Inside, he found stacks of cash, several uncashed checks, and an old leather-bound journal. The journal was filled with cryptic entries, many of which referenced settling debts and reclaiming what's owed. But there was more. A single entry stood out. "Marie Larkin will be the key. If I can't control her, I'll have to let her go." The implications were chilling. Had Kent been blackmailing Marie? Or had she been involved in something far darker than anyone had realized? As Lawson sifted through more of Kent's notes, he discovered something even more disturbing. Marie had been under pressure. The life insurance policy, the debts, the mysterious payments. It all started to make sense. Marie had been trying to pay off something or someone, but now it seemed like she had been caught in a game that was much bigger than she had realized. Lawson now had enough to confront Kent, but as he prepared to track down the elusive man, something else came to light. Kent wasn't the only one involved. Marie's late husband, James, had been part of a network of shady individuals, and Kent was simply the latest in a long line of people who had used Marie as a pawn. It seemed like everyone had been taking from her in some way, pushing her closer and closer to the edge. It wasn't just about money, it was about control. Whoever had killed Marie They had wanted something from her. Maybe it was revenge. Maybe it was something more sinister. But whoever had done it had been carefully orchestrating every move in a game of manipulation and deceit. After weeks of investigating and following a trail of lies and deceit, Lawson finally closed in on Damon Kent. But what he discovered was far more complex than he had ever imagined. Kent was no longer in hiding. In fact, he was in plain sight, the very person behind Marie's death. The final pieces of the puzzle fell into place when Lawson uncovered a chilling truth. Kent had not only been involved with Marie's late husband, James, but he had also been her lover in the months leading up to her death. Their relationship had been fraught with betrayal, secrets, and manipulations. Kent had blackmailed Marie into keeping quiet about their affair, using her debts and her late husband's shady connections to control her. But Marie had begun to fight back, trying to break free from Kent's grip. She had planned to expose him, to tell the world the truth about her past, but Kent couldn't allow that. In a desperate attempt to keep her quiet, he had poisoned her with a slow-acting toxin, watching as she suffered in silence before finally succumbing to death. Detective Lawson sat at his desk, the dim light of his office casting long shadows across the room. The walls were lined with case files, all of them leading nowhere. This case, however, was different. Every time he thought he had a piece of the puzzle, another layer of deception revealed itself. It was late, but Lawson couldn't shake the feeling that something was still missing from the case. Something about Marie's life, about Damon Kent, about James Larkin. It all felt interconnected in a way that he couldn't quite place. The journal entries from Kent's apartment kept running through his mind. Marie Larkin will be the key. What did that mean? And why had Kent gone to such lengths to control her? Was it just money, or was there something more personal behind it? Lawson glanced at his phone. There was a message from his colleague, Officer Emma Riley. She had been helping him with the financial records of Marie and her late husband, James. "I've found something strange. James Larkin was involved in some kind of underground venture, a money laundering operation, but it wasn't through the usual channels. It was secret, compartmentalized. I need you to come over." Lawson's pulse quickened. This was the breakthrough he had been waiting for. He grabbed his coat and headed out. When Lawson arrived at the station, Officer Riley was already waiting for him, a stack of documents spread out on the table in front of her. She looked up as he walked in, her eyes sharp. "I dug deeper into James Larkin's finances," Riley said, pointing to a series of encrypted files on her computer. "These transactions don't make sense. I thought they were clean at first, but they're linked to offshore accounts and shell companies." Lawson frowned. So, James wasn't just dealing with real estate deals? He was laundering money? Exactly. But the real kicker is, these accounts weren't just for laundering. They were connected to something larger, something more organized. Riley tapped a few keys, bringing up a map of connections on her screen. James Larkin was a part of a network. I traced it back to a name, a man named Simon Rook. "Simon Rook?" Lawson echoed. He didn't recognize the name. "Who is he?" Riley's fingers flew over the keyboard. "I'm still digging, but from what I can tell, he's connected to organized crime. He's been on the radar for years, but he always managed to stay one step ahead. I think James was caught up in his scheme, and it looks like Kent may have been involved too." Lawson took a seat, rubbing his temples. It was becoming clear this wasn't just about a widow's finances or a bitter ex-business partner. This was about something far larger, an underground network that spanned multiple industries, using people like James and Marie Larkin as pawns. "We need to find out more about Simon Rook," Lawson said, standing up. "If Kent is tied to him, then he's part of something much darker than I anticipated." Riley nodded, already pulling up Rook's criminal history. "I'll dig further, but this could get dangerous, Lawson." "I know," he said quietly, "but we're already in deep." Days passed, and Lawson's investigation grew more urgent. Simon Rook was like a ghost. Every lead he followed was a dead end. Rook's name had been tied to a series of illegal operations, but no one had ever been able to pin anything on him. He was meticulous, controlled, too careful to leave behind a trail. Lawson had a hunch. Rook's empire had to have a base, a hub where he operated, a place where his resources were concentrated. Lawson and Riley pored over old records, linking the dots between Rook's associates and the locations where James Larkin had been. It wasn't long before they uncovered a small, unassuming warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The warehouse didn't look like much. It was tucked away behind a row of other industrial buildings, the kind of place most people would overlook. But Lawson knew it was the perfect cover for someone like Rook. He and Riley approached cautiously, ducking behind a pile of crates to avoid being seen. "What do you think is in there?" Riley whispered. "I'm not sure, but whatever it is, it's important," Lawson replied. "Rook is too careful to leave something this close to the city unless it's a significant operation." They waited, watching the warehouse from their hiding spot, when finally a car pulled up. Two men stepped out, carrying large crates between them. They didn't look like ordinary workers. Lawson's instincts told him that this wasn't just a delivery. This was a transfer. "We need to get closer," Lawson said, his voice low. "Stay quiet." They moved closer, careful not to make a sound. As they neared the building, they saw the two men entering through a side door, crates in hand. Lawson motioned for Riley to follow him. They slipped inside the warehouse, their footsteps muffled by the thick dust on the floor. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of chemicals and oil. It looked like a shipping warehouse, but there was something about the place that felt off. Too many locked rooms, too many doors that led nowhere. They moved deeper into the heart of the warehouse. In the back, they found a large office area, dimly lit, with a single desk cluttered with papers. Lawson rifled through them quickly, his eyes scanning for anything useful. And then he found it. A file marked Rook Operation Phoenix. It detailed a network of financial transactions, names, dates, and locations. Every detail that could connect Simon Rook to a number of high-profile criminal activities, including money laundering, arms dealing, and even human trafficking. But what caught Lawson's attention was one name, Marie Larkin. Her name appeared several times in the file, tied to a number of financial transactions and agreements. Marie had been much more involved in Rook's operation than anyone had realized. She hadn't just been a pawn. She had been an active player. "This is it," Lawson whispered, turning to Riley. Marie knew exactly what was going on. She was a part of this, and that's why she had to be silenced. With the evidence from the warehouse in hand, Lawson knew the time for subtlety was over. He had enough to confront Simon Rook. The case had taken a dangerous turn, and the closer he got to the truth, the more dangerous it became. Rook wasn't just some white-collar criminal. He was a mastermind, and he would stop at nothing to protect his empire. Lawson and Riley put together a plan to take Rook down, but they needed backup. As much as Lawson wanted to go it alone, he knew this was too big. He couldn't afford to be reckless. The night of the confrontation arrived, and Lawson, along with a team of officers, descended on Rook's mansion. It was heavily guarded, but Lawson had anticipated that. He led the charge, moving swiftly through the grounds, taking out the guards one by one. When they reached the mansion's interior, they found Rook sitting in his study, his face unreadable. "So, the detective has come," Rook said, his voice cold but composed. "I've been expecting you." Lawson's gun was aimed directly at him. "This ends tonight, Rook. You're done." Rook chuckled, unfazed. "You think you can stop me? Do you even know what you've uncovered? You've barely scratched the surface of what I've built." "I know enough," Lawson replied, his voice steady. "You killed Marie because she knew too much. You thought you could control her, but she was never really yours." Rook's expression darkened. "She wasn't supposed to get in my way." She was a fool. I gave her everything she needed, and in the end, she betrayed me." Lawson took a step closer, his gaze never leaving Rook. "You're not going to get away with this. You and your entire operation are going down." And with that, the final chapter of The Vanishing Widow unfolded, as the police moved in to arrest Simon Rook and dismantle his criminal empire. Lawson had solved the case, but as he watched Rook being led away in cuffs, he couldn't help but wonder, how many other secrets had Marie Larkin kept hidden? And how many others were still out there, waiting to be uncovered? Story 3. The early morning fog lingered like a heavy blanket over the mansion as Detective Alexander Harper stepped out of his car. He could barely make out the grand silhouette of the house ahead, its dark, looming structure rising out of the mist. Harper had been called to the scene after the body of Graham Everett, a reclusive millionaire with a reputation for secrecy, was found strangled in one of his private rooms. Everett had lived a life in the shadows, his fortune built from a string of failed businesses and ill-fated investments. He disappeared from public life years ago, retreating to his sprawling estate on the outskirts of town, where he kept to himself. His eccentricities were well known, but few could say they had actually seen him in person. Harper approached the mansion, his boots crunching on the gravel pathway. He was met by Officer Calloway, a young cop whose face was pale from the sight inside. "The room's this way," Calloway said, leading Harper through the ornate entryway. Inside, the mansion was a maze of corridors and rooms filled with expensive but outdated furniture. A chandelier cast dim light over the grand hallway, its crystals flickering like distant stars. As they walked, Calloway began to explain the situation. Everett was found dead in a soundproof room of all places. The door was locked from the inside, and there were no signs of forced entry. It doesn't make sense. No one knows how the killer got in or how they left. Harper's brows furrowed. A soundproof room? What kind of person has a room like that? You'd be surprised. Everett was always eccentric, Calloway replied, his voice tense. But there's more. We found something strange. A recording device was left behind, playing whispers in reverse. Whispers? Harper's interest peaked. Yeah, as if someone had recorded something and played it backward. We thought it was a clue, but it's eerie. No one knows what it means. Harper followed Calloway into a large, dimly lit room at the far end of the house. The door creaked open, revealing the dark interior. The walls were lined with soundproofing foam, and the air smelled faintly of dust and stale air. In the center of the room, Graham Everett's body lay slumped in a chair, his neck twisted at an unnatural angle, a faint bruise around his throat. What was he doing in here? Harper muttered under his breath. Isn't this a private recording room? Yes, sir. There's no other furniture, just the chair and the equipment for recording. Calloway stepped forward to a table, where a strange device sat. It looked like a simple tape recorder, but with a series of buttons and dials that didn't quite make sense. The device was still running, the eerie whispers crackling in reverse through the speakers. Harper moved closer, staring at the tape as it spun. Play it forward, Harper said quietly. Calloway hesitated, then pressed a button. The whispers grew louder, and Harper's hand instinctively went to his chin. The words, though distorted and fragmented, were clear enough to send a chill down his spine. It's not the money, not the business. It's the secret, the one you buried. Harper's eyes narrowed. The voice was familiar, though he couldn't place it. He looked at Calloway. What does this mean? It's the only clue we have so far, Calloway replied, his voice low. But whatever it is, it's connected to Everett's past. We need to figure out who he was hiding from. Harper exhaled slowly. And how he died. The whispers played on, each word like a thread in the tangled web of Graham Everett's life. A life full of shadows, secrets, and betrayal. Harper knew one thing for certain. There was more to Everett's death than met the eye. The first step in any investigation was to understand the victim. Graham Everett had made a name for himself in the business world, but his success was never as public as it seemed. His wealth had come from a series of deals and investments in ventures that had failed spectacularly. Despite this, he had managed to accumulate enough money to live in luxury, and his reclusiveness only seemed to add to his mystique. Harper spent the following day combing through the records of Everett's past, his business ventures, associates, and personal history. There were no significant criminal records or charges against him, but there were whispers. Whispers about his troubled past. He'd lost a wife under mysterious circumstances years ago, and his ventures had been marked by accusations of fraud, though nothing had ever been proven. Harper paid a visit to the only person who might know more about Everett's personal life, Elizabeth Townsend, his former business partner and the last person to see him alive. She lived in a modest house near the city, far removed from the wealth and power she'd once shared with Graham. Harper found her in the middle of her garden, pruning the roses. She looked up as he approached, her expression guarded. "Detective Harper," she said, her voice tinged with surprise but not fear. "I know why you're here." "You were close to Graham," Harper began. "I need to understand more about his life, his past. What kind of man was he?" Elizabeth paused, wiping her hands on her apron. Graham was brilliant. He had a mind like no other, but he was also paranoid, always looking over his shoulder, always worried that someone was out to get him. He isolated himself, slowly pushing everyone away, even me. "What happened between you two?" Harper pressed. Elizabeth's eyes clouded with something darker, regret, perhaps. "He was obsessed with something. I never quite understood it. There was talk of a betrayal, some deal gone wrong, but I wasn't in the loop when it happened. The last time I saw him was 5 years ago, just after he lost his wife. He never got over it." "His wife?" Harper echoed. "What happened to her?" "Catherine Everett. She died in a car accident, but Graham believed it wasn't an accident. He said someone had orchestrated it, that it was a message." Harper's mind raced. Did he ever mention anything about what the message was? Elizabeth shook her head. He became consumed by it. After her death, he locked himself away in that mansion. "I think whatever happened to her, it's tied to what happened to him." Harper's thoughts began to piece together fragments of a dangerous narrative. Graham Everett's isolation was no accident. It was a defense. He was hiding something dark from his past, and whatever it was, it had led to his death. "Who was he hiding from?" Harper asked, his voice steady but urgent. "I don't know," Elizabeth replied, "but I think you're right to investigate the whispers. I've heard rumors, things I never paid much attention to before. But maybe it's time someone else heard them." Harper stood in silence, contemplating the weight of Elizabeth's words. If Everett's death was tied to a long-buried secret, then there were people out there who wanted that secret to stay hidden. And whoever they weren't finished with Everett yet. Harper returned to the mansion, his mind buzzing with questions. Elizabeth's comments about Everett's paranoia and the mysterious betrayal left a trail that Harper knew he had to follow. But there was something more pressing. He needed to decode the whispers. The soundproof room where Graham had been killed seemed like the perfect place to start. Harper spent hours combing through every inch of the space, looking for any clues that might shed light on what had really happened. The recording device was still in the center of the room, its tape now ejected and resting beside it. Harper picked it up carefully, his fingers brushing the surface as if it might reveal something new. He placed the tape back in the recorder and rewound it to the beginning, playing it again. "It's not the money, not the business. It's the secret, the one you buried." The voice on the tape sent a shiver through Harper. This wasn't just a random clue. It was a message, deliberately left for him. But who was the voice? And what was the secret? Harper paused the tape and considered. The word buried seemed significant. What had Everett buried? Was it a crime, a person, or something far more personal? He needed to find out. He turned back to the mansion's records and began searching through old files, hoping something would jump out at him. His eyes landed on an old photograph. Graham Everett, standing with a group of men in front of a mansion. One of the men looked familiar, though Harper couldn't place him at first. He studied the photo more closely. The man in question was wearing a dark suit, his face obscured by shadows. But something about him seemed to connect with the whispers. Harper's intuition was pulling him toward the past, the time before Everett's isolation, before his paranoid retreat from the world. Harper made a note to track down the man in the photo. He had a feeling that this would be the key to unraveling Everett's dark secret and the truth behind his murder. The evening was drawing in as Detective Harper sifted through the papers spread across the desk in front of him. His mind was racing with the details of Graham Everett's life, each one like a piece of a puzzle that was just beginning to take shape. The photograph of Everett with a group of men, however, stood out as the most significant clue yet. Harper had no idea who the man was, but the haunting feeling in his gut told him that this person was connected to Everett's dark past. The photo had been taken in the early 90s, judging by the fashion and the car parked behind them. This was a time when Everett had been running several business ventures and, by all accounts, still had a reputation in the financial world. Harper made a mental note to track down every person in the photograph. But the man who stood out the most, the one Harper instinctively knew he needed to find, was the one with the dark suit and shadowed face. He was standing closest to Everett, his hand resting on Graham's shoulder, in a gesture that could almost be considered a symbol of ownership. Harper dialed his phone, requesting the photo's source from the mansion's archives, and then began searching for the man in the image. His mind wandered to the whispers, the cryptic message left behind in the soundproof room. The secret, the one you buried. What secret was buried so deep that Graham Everett would have gone to such lengths to hide it? His phone buzzed. The archivist had sent over the details. The photograph was taken at a gala for a high-profile business partnership. The man in the dark suit was identified as Vincent Mallory, a name that rang no immediate bells. Vincent Mallory wasn't a well-known name in the business community. In fact, Harper couldn't find any record of him in the last decade. It was as if Mallory had disappeared from the public eye entirely. A search of old newspapers and business articles only revealed one thing. Vincent Mallory had once been a part of a highly secretive venture with Everett, a venture that had collapsed into scandal and allegations of fraud. Harper leaned back in his chair, a sense of unease creeping over him. If Mallory was involved in this scandal, and if he had ties to Everett that spanned years, then it was likely that Mallory had a motive for murder. But why strangle Everett in such a personal and brutal manner? Was this really about the money, or was there something more? The following morning, Harper set out to find Vincent Mallory. The more he researched, the more he found that Mallory had kept a low profile ever since the business partnership with Everett crumbled. There were no public appearances, no recent mentions in business circles. It was as if Mallory had disappeared into thin air, a ghost of the past. Harper's first lead took him to an old warehouse on the outskirts of town. The address listed in public records was still valid, though the warehouse appeared to be abandoned. A strange sense of foreboding filled the air as Harper parked his car in front of the building, its exterior covered in peeling paint and ivy. The windows were boarded up, and the silence surrounding the area was almost suffocating. He approached the entrance cautiously, his hand instinctively going to his holster. The door creaked loudly as he pushed it open, revealing a dark interior filled with dust and forgotten equipment. The air smelled stale, the faint odor of old metal and wood mixed with something more pungent. It was as though the place had been untouched for years. As Harper moved deeper into the warehouse, his flashlight illuminated rows of shelves filled with old crates and unused machinery. It was when he reached the back of the warehouse that he noticed something strange. A small office in the far corner, its door slightly ajar. Inside, a desk was piled with papers, many of them yellowed with age. But what caught Harper's attention was the large metal safe sitting against the far wall. Harper stepped forward, his fingers brushing over the cold surface of the safe. He tried the handle. It was locked, of course, but as he examined it more closely, a small detail caught his eye. The safe was old, but there was a fresh scratch on the corner, as if someone had recently tried to force it open. He pulled out his phone and called for backup, but as he waited for the team to arrive, something else gnawed at his thoughts. Why was this office left behind, so deliberately untouched? Was it a trap? Had Mallory been here recently, or had he known Harper would eventually come looking for him? The team arrived quickly, and Harper explained his find. They worked together to crack the safe, the combination taking a few minutes to decipher. When the door finally opened, it revealed a collection of old files, along with a large leather-bound journal. Harper pulled the journal out first, flipping through its pages. The handwriting was neat, precise, a stark contrast to the chaos of Everett's life. The journal chronicled the rise and fall of the business partnership between Mallory and Everett, detailing their joint investments and their eventual involvement in a shady real estate deal that had turned sour. But it wasn't the business dealings that Harper found interesting. It was the entries that mentioned a third party, someone who had been manipulating both men from the shadows. "One step ahead of us," Harper muttered, reading one of the passages aloud. "We've been betrayed. Someone has been playing both sides. I'm not sure who they are, but I think they're the ones pulling the strings." It seemed that, whatever secret had been buried all these years, Mallory and Everett were both victims of a much larger plot. But who was the third party, and how did they fit into the puzzle of Everett's death? The next few pages offered even more chilling details. Mallory's suspicions of a mole within their organization, his growing fears of someone within his inner circle, and the sudden disappearance of an unnamed partner. A partner who, according to Mallory, had known too much. The name of that partner was not revealed in the journal, but the final entry seemed to give a clue. "I can't trust anyone anymore. If I don't act now, everything we've built will be destroyed. I need to stop Graham before he exposes us all." Harper closed the journal, his heart pounding in his chest. Mallory had wanted to stop Everett, perhaps to protect a deeper, more dangerous secret. Was this the motive for murder? Was this what had pushed someone to strangle Graham Everett in that isolated room? As Harper stood in the warehouse, staring at the journal, one final thought gnawed at his mind. If Everett had known too much, was that the reason he'd been killed? And more importantly, had Mallory been part of the conspiracy? Or had he, too, been a victim of the true mastermind behind it all? Harper had a name, Catherine Ward, a former associate of Everett and Mallory, who had worked with them during the height of their business empire. Ward had been a behind-the-scenes figure, known for her ability to manipulate others and control situations with ruthless efficiency, but she had disappeared from the public eye after the real estate deal gone wrong, her role in the scandal buried along with her reputation. Harper dug deeper into Catherine Ward's life, uncovering a dark and unsettling truth. She had not only been involved in the fraudulent deals, but she had also been in a secret relationship with both Mallory and Everett at different times. Harper had a growing suspicion that Ward had played the two men against each other, using their greed and ambition to set them on a path toward destruction. The final pieces of the puzzle fell into place when Harper discovered Ward's current location, an isolated cabin on the edge of town, far removed from the world she had once controlled. With no time to waste, Harper gathered his team and headed there, knowing this would be the moment of truth. The drive to Catherine Ward's cabin was uneventful, though the tension in the air was palpable. Harper's team was on edge, their senses alert to any sign of danger. Ward had been in hiding for years, and the way she'd managed to stay under the radar spoke volumes about her resourcefulness and the extent of her manipulation. As they approached the cabin, the forest surrounding it grew denser, the trees looming like silent sentinels. The cabin itself was isolated, nestled in the heart of the woods, its exterior worn and neglected. It was the perfect place for someone like Ward to disappear, hidden from the prying eyes of the world. Harper parked the car at the edge of the clearing, signaling for his team to remain quiet and follow his lead. They moved slowly, the crunch of the leaves beneath their feet, the only sound breaking the silence of the forest. "Stay sharp," Harper whispered to Officer Calloway, who was a few steps behind him. They reached the cabin door, which was ajar, swinging lightly in the breeze. Harper's hand instinctively went to his gun as he signaled for the team to surround the building. He pushed the door open with a creak, the inside of the cabin dark and musty. It smelled faintly of mildew and something more acrid, like the remnants of burnt wood. "Clear," Calloway said, checking the adjacent rooms. "No one here." Harper stepped further into the cabin, his eyes scanning the room. It was sparsely furnished, with just a few pieces of mismatched furniture and old, yellowing papers scattered across a table. On the far side of the room, a stack of books caught Harper's eye. Books on psychology, manipulation, and power dynamics. It didn't take long to realize that Catherine Ward had spent her years here carefully honing her craft, preparing for something, or someone, to come. Then Harper saw it. The desk in the corner was covered in more documents, some of them familiar, others unfamiliar. He moved toward it, his heart pounding. The first thing he noticed was a photograph, a picture of Graham Everett, Vincent Mallory, and a much younger-looking Catherine Ward. They were all smiling, standing in front of a large office building, arms around each other as though they were partners in something far greater than just business. But there was something different about the photograph. Catherine's eyes. In the picture, her gaze seemed calculating, almost predatory, as though she were silently controlling the two men beside her. Harper's mind raced. If Ward had been the third party mentioned in Mallory's journal, then she was the one who had orchestrated everything. She had played both Everett and Mallory for years, using their vulnerabilities and greed to manipulate them into a deadly game. And now, after all this time, it seemed that she was still pulling the strings. As Harper examined the rest of the papers, his fingers landed on a final document, an old letter. The handwriting was unmistakable. Graham Everett. It was dated just days before his death. "Catherine, you've gone too far this time. I know what you're doing, and I can't be part of it anymore. I've set things in motion, and I'm going to expose everything. If you think you can control me, you're wrong. I've seen through you. This is the last time you will use me. I will bring everything to light, no matter the cost." Harper felt a cold wave wash over him. Everett had known. He had uncovered Catherine Ward's manipulations, and he had been preparing to expose her. But it was too late. Ward had already decided that Everett's betrayal would cost him his life. As he read the letter, a noise from the back of the cabin caught his attention. Harper's instincts kicked in, and he motioned for his team to stay back. The sound came again, a soft creak of a floorboard, followed by a whisper of movement. "Stay here," Harper said, pulling his gun from its holster as he moved toward the back of the cabin. Harper's footsteps were slow and deliberate as he crept toward the source of the noise. The back door of the cabin led to a small hallway, and at the end of it, there was a set of stairs that descended into the basement. Harper's flashlight flickered as he descended the stairs, the air growing colder with each step. The basement was dimly lit, but Harper could make out the shape of a figure at the far end, sitting at a table. The figure was hunched over, staring intently at something in their hands. Harper's pulse quickened as he stepped closer, his flashlight illuminating the figure's face. Catherine Ward looked up, her sharp features betraying no hint of fear. She had been expecting him. "So, Detective," she said, her voice calm and measured, "I was wondering how long it would take for you to find me." Harper's grip on his gun tightened, though he didn't raise it. "I knew you were behind it all, Catherine. Your manipulations, your games with Everett and Mallory. You thought you could get away with it, but I'm here to make sure you don't." Ward smiled, but it wasn't a smile of defeat. It was one of victory, as if she had already won. "You think you understand everything, don't you, Detective? You think you know who the players are, but you're missing the bigger picture." Harper took a step forward. "What do you mean? You don't understand the real reason I killed Graham, do you? It wasn't because of some petty betrayal. It wasn't about money or power. No, it was because Graham knew something that threatened everything I had worked for. He was going to expose me, yes, but more importantly, he was going to expose you." Harper froze, his mind racing. "Expose me? What are you talking about?" Ward's smile widened. "You're not just some innocent detective, Harper. You've been involved in this from the start. You were too close to Everett, too invested in this case, and that's because you've been hiding something yourself." Harper's blood ran cold. Ward was right. He had always felt an odd connection to Everett's case, but he never questioned why. Now, standing in front of her, he realized that she was playing him just like she had played everyone else. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. He had been chasing a ghost. Ward had known about his past, his own connection to the criminal world, one that he had buried long ago. "That's right," Ward said, as if reading his thoughts. "You're just as much a part of the web as they were. And now it's time for you to decide. Do you expose me and lose everything, or do you walk away and let me finish what I started?" Harper's mind whirled as he weighed his options. He had never considered that his own secrets might be tied to this case. But now, with Ward's cold gaze locked on him, he realized that the lines between right and wrong were blurred in ways he hadn't anticipated. Harper stood in the basement, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Ward's words echoed in his ears, the weight of her revelation sinking in. For years, he had buried the truth about his own past, his previous life as a detective on the edge of the law, a man who had once crossed lines for the right price. But he had changed. He had left that life behind, or so he thought. Now, with the truth laid bare in front of him, he was faced with a choice. Ward had her secrets, but so did he. And as she had manipulated the men around her, so too had he been manipulated into this case. He could feel the sweat beading on his forehead as he slowly lowered his gun. "You're not going to get away with this," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind. Ward tilted her head, intrigued by his sudden calmness. "Oh, but Detective, I already have." With a flick of her wrist, she pressed a button on the table, activating a hidden speaker. A low electronic hum filled the air, followed by the distorted voice of Graham Everett. The final words of the recording echoed through the room. "I know you're coming for me, but I have nothing left to lose. You've lost control, Catherine. The truth is buried, but it's not forgotten." Harper's heart pounded as he listened to Everett's final message, realizing that it was this secret that had driven Catherine to kill, but it was also the secret that would now be her undoing. The game was over. The truth was finally in his hands. The hum of the hidden speaker faded, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. Harper's fingers tightened around the grip of his gun. He was close now, closer than ever to unraveling the mystery that had consumed him. He was staring at Catherine Ward, the woman who had orchestrated it all, her cold eyes never leaving his. "You didn't think it would end this easily, did you, Detective?" Ward's voice was smooth, almost soothing, as if she were speaking to a child who didn't yet understand the game he was playing. Harper's jaw clenched. "I don't know what you're trying to do, Catherine, but it's over. You're not going to control this situation anymore." Ward's smile didn't falter. "Oh, I'm not trying to control anything. The pieces are already in motion. You've already made your choice." The air seemed to thicken, as if the walls themselves were listening, waiting for the inevitable. Harper stood motionless, trying to process the situation, but Ward's words kept spinning in his mind. "You've made your choice." What did she mean by that? Had he already played into her hands, unaware? "Those whispers you heard in the soundproof room," Ward continued, her tone growing colder. "They weren't just about Graham. They were about you too, Detective. You've been so focused on uncovering the truth about Graham Everett, but you've never once thought to ask why it all felt familiar. Haven't you wondered why you were the one called to this case? The one who seemed to know exactly where to look?" Harper's breath hitched. His own past had been haunting him, shadows he'd buried years ago. Ward had been subtly pulling at those threads all along, guiding him to this moment where the past collided with the present. He had ignored his instincts for too long, and now it seemed that everything was tied back to him. "You're lying," Harper muttered, though his voice wavered slightly. Ward raised an eyebrow, almost pityingly. "Am I? The truth is, Detective, you're just like Graham and Vincent. You're just another pawn in a game you don't understand." Her words stung, but Harper steadied himself. He had to think. He had to make her slip up, reveal the final piece. His mind raced as he processed everything that had happened. The secrets, the betrayals, the deaths. And then it hit him. Graham's letter. The one that had been in the journal. The one that had spoken of a third party. That third party was Ward, but there was more to it than just her ambition. Ward had manipulated everything. She had orchestrated the downfall of the men who once trusted her, but the one thing she never expected was that Harper would become part of the story. "Why Graham? Why kill him?" Harper asked, trying to keep his voice steady, even though his mind was spiraling. "Because, Detective, he was the only one who ever got too close to the truth. He was dangerous. He started to realize what I'd been doing, how I used people, how I controlled them. He didn't want to just expose me. He wanted to take everything down with him." Harper could feel the weight of the situation settling over him. Ward had been ruthless in her manipulation of the men around her, but Everett had uncovered her darkest secret, and that had sealed his fate. Harper lowered his gun slightly, taking a deep breath. "And you thought killing him would keep the truth buried?" Ward's eyes narrowed. "It was the only choice. It was either him or me, and I'm not about to let anyone tear down everything I've built." "Built on lies," Harper shot back. "Built on people's lives." Ward's lips curled into a snarl. "You're naive if you think you can walk away from this. You've already made your choice, Harper. You've already decided whose side you're on." The words stung again, but Harper knew what he had to do. He could feel the dark weight of the decision in his gut, but he couldn't let her manipulate him any further. He needed to expose her. He needed to put an end to this. The next few moments felt like they stretched into eternity. Ward was calm, but Harper could see the flicker of anxiety behind her eyes. Her control was slipping, and that made her dangerous. "I don't care what you think," Ward spat, stepping closer to Harper, her voice venomous. "The truth is already in motion. You've already chosen to play your part, and you're too deep now to get out. You can't just walk away from all this. Don't think for a second that you're the hero of this story. You're as much a part of it as anyone." Harper stood his ground, his mind racing. The door to the cabin suddenly felt miles away. Was she right? Had he unknowingly walked into a trap set by Ward long ago? Or was there still a chance for him to do the right thing? Then, Harper's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a car engine from outside. He motioned for his team to stay low, pressing his back against the wall of the basement. The sound of tires on gravel echoed through the silence as the vehicle approached. Ward didn't seem startled at all. In fact, she appeared almost expectant. "Don't worry, Detective. They're coming to collect what's mine," she said, her tone dripping with confidence. Harper's heart raced. He had no idea who she was referring to, but the danger was clear now. There was no longer a question of if something was going to happen. It was only a matter of when. The car stopped just outside the cabin, and Harper could hear the unmistakable sound of doors opening. Ward's smirk grew wider. She knew exactly who had arrived. "Vincent Mallory," she said, her voice laced with satisfaction. "You see, Detective, none of this ever ends. People like us don't just walk away from this life. We pull the strings, we play the game, and then we collect our prize." Harper's mind raced. Vincent Mallory? Hadn't he disappeared years ago? He had to be here for a reason. There was something far bigger at play than just the murder of Graham Everett. "Come with me," Ward said, motioning toward the stairs leading up to the main floor. "You'll see for yourself." Harper was hesitant. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to walk away, to turn his back on this madness. But he knew that if he didn't take action now, it might be too late. This was bigger than just him. It was about exposing the network of corruption, manipulation, and deceit that had tied Everett, Mallory, and Ward together. Harper ascended the stairs slowly, keeping his gun ready. As he stepped into the dimly lit living room, he saw Vincent Mallory standing by the door, his expression cold, distant. The two men locked eyes. "So the detective has finally caught up," Mallory said, his voice low but full of menace. Ward stepped forward, her eyes glinting with satisfaction. "Vincent, Graham may have known too much, but now Harper knows everything. Everything about us, about the game we've been playing. He's the final piece, Vincent." Mallory stared at Harper with a mixture of contempt and calculation. "You think you understand all of this? You think you've pieced it together? We're all just players in a much larger game. Don't you get it?" Harper stood silently, the weight of the situation pressing on him. The truth was just out of reach, but now he was finally in a position to expose it all. If he could survive the storm that was about to break. He raised his gun. "The game is over." The room was thick with tension. Harper stood in the middle, his gun aimed at Mallory and Ward, both of whom were unfazed by the confrontation. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, but his mind was clearer than it had been in days. He knew what he had to do. This wasn't just about stopping them anymore. It was about the truth. "Put the gun down, Harper," Mallory said, his voice eerily calm, a slight smirk playing at the corners of his lips. "You're not going to shoot us. You never will." Ward stepped forward, her eyes glinting with a mixture of frustration and amusement. "You're the one who's been chasing ghosts, Detective. Graham was a fool, and so are you. You think you can stop this? You're too deep in it now." But Harper didn't flinch. "I'm not the one who's lost control," he said, his voice firm. "You were never in charge, Catherine. You just thought you were." The air hung heavy, like a storm on the horizon. There was a moment of stillness, like the world was holding its breath. Then the crack of a distant thunderclap echoed through the cabin, reminding them all that there was no turning back. Harper's mind raced. He could pull the trigger, end it right now, and maybe he would stop their reign of terror. Maybe he could walk away and leave the world behind with a small sense of justice. But the truth was far more complicated. Ward and Mallory had been playing a game for years, manipulating people for their own gain, creating lies and betrayals that had shattered lives. But Harper had his own truth to face. This wasn't just about stopping them. It was about facing the consequences of his own choices. His past had caught up with him in this moment. His own darkness was entangled with theirs, and it was time to deal with it once and for all. He lowered his gun. Harper's hand shook slightly, but he kept the weapon lowered, his finger no longer poised on the trigger. The decision wasn't easy, but he knew it was the right one. This wasn't about vengeance or satisfying his own sense of justice. It was about understanding the bigger picture, about not becoming the very thing he had sworn to fight against. "You're right about one thing," Harper said, meeting Mallory's cold stare. "I've been chasing ghosts, and I've been running from mine." He turned to Ward, his eyes narrowing. "But no more." Ward's face twisted in disbelief. "What are you talking about, Detective?" "I'm talking about taking responsibility," Harper continued, "about finally exposing the truth. Not just about you, but about everything. The manipulation, the lies, and the damage you've caused." He motioned for the officers outside to come in, signaling for them to secure the two criminals. Mallory and Ward barely had time to react before they were surrounded by law enforcement. "You're finished," Harper said, his voice steady. "It's over. The game's over." As Ward and Mallory were taken away, Harper stood still, allowing the weight of it all to sink in. The case was closed, but the journey wasn't over for him. The truth about Graham Everett, about Mallory, about Ward, it was all out in the open. But there was one more truth Harper had to face, his own. In the days that followed, the media exploded with the revelations of the conspiracy that had unfolded behind the scenes of Graham Everett's death. The shocking connections between Vincent Mallory, Catherine Ward, and the shady dealings they had engaged in were finally exposed. The public was captivated by the drama, but for Harper, the storm was far from over. He stood by his office window, staring out at the city below. It was a clear night, but the darkness seemed to stretch endlessly before him. The weight of the decisions he had made over the past few weeks still pressed on him. As the case was closed and the criminals were taken into custody, Harper realized that he had become part of something far bigger than himself, a tangled web of lies and corruption that reached deeper than he had ever imagined. Yet, as much as he wanted to walk away, the truth had changed him. He had uncovered secrets about the people he thought he knew, and in doing so, had unraveled parts of himself that he had long tried to forget. The phone on his desk buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. He picked it up. "Detective Harper," the voice on the other end said, "you've been through a lot, but we need to talk." Harper hesitated, recognizing the voice. It was his old colleague, someone he had trusted, someone from his past, the one person who had always known too much. For a moment, Harper thought about ignoring the call. He had enough of secrets, enough of the darkness. But then he realized, maybe it was time to face it once more. He set the phone down and walked to the door, stepping into the night. There was still more to uncover, more truths to face, and perhaps more ghosts to chase. But for the first time in a long time, Harper wasn't running. He was finally ready to confront whatever came next.